Okay, so let me introduce myself. I'm Jenny Gibbons. I'm a dairy scientist at AHDB Dairy, and I'm absolutely delighted to be bringing you tonight's webinar on opportunities and challenges in calf housing and management for the next decade. Our presenter tonight is Nina von Keyserlingk from the University of British Columbia in Canada, and I'm very privileged to have Nina sitting here right next to me for tonight's webinar. Tonight's webinar has also been delivered as part of our Euro Dairy network. This is a network of 14 countries from Ireland to Poland and Sweden to Italy, and it aims to put farmers at the centre of practice-based innovation by sharing knowledge and solutions. And if you're not familiar with Euro Dairy, then you can pop on the website at www.eurodairy.eu. So a big welcome to all of our European farmers who are joining us tonight. In fact, we've had nearly 300 people in total register for the webinar, so nearly a record breaking number registrations over the last week. So without further delay, I'm delighted to introduce Nina. Nina holds an industrial research chair at the University of British Columbia, and she is recognised internationally for her research on care and housing of dairy cattle and calves. But before joining UBC's Animal Welfare Program, she worked for several years as a research scientist for the animal feed industry. She grew up on a beef cattle ranch in BC, and after leaving the ranch, she went on to do her degree in agricultural sciences, and following that with a master's in animal science, and then finally her PhD at the University of British Columbia. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the controls to Nina.
Thanks, Jenny. And I wanted to say a big thank you to Jenny and the rest of the AHDB group for bringing me over. And I've had a wonderful few days. I was initially at the University of Nottingham for a couple of days, and well, maybe only a day and a half. I'm a bit jet lagged at the moment, so I'm not quite sure if I'm on day 3 or day 4 at the moment. But anyways, thank you for the invitation, and thank you to everybody who took the time to sit down in front of their computer and sort of listen to me talk for, as Jenny said, about a half an hour about calves. I wanted to also recognize my colleague Dan Weary. Without him, really, it's the two of us that do this work. We spearhead this work together, and then we have had a myriad of graduate students and postdocs who have all made this work possible. But I also need to recognize the Dairy Farmers of Canada, the BC Dairy Association, WestGen, Merck, Zoetis, the Beef Cattle, British Columbia Industry Development Fund, Novus, Alberta Milk, Valacta, and DHI. And these are all industry partners who have partnered with us in the Industrial Research Chair in Cattle Welfare. That they all put their dollars on the table, and the biggest partners are the dairy farmers themselves. They make the largest proportion of the money comes from them, and we're able to in Canada match this through federal funds, and they've placed their trust in us. We get together to decide every 5 years sort of what the themes are, and calves have always played a central role in the Industrial Research Chair. So over the next sort of 25 minutes, I want to talk to you about sort of 3 primary areas that we've been working on in calf. So I'm going to talk about feeding calves more milk via a nipple, feeding more milk. Once you feed more milk, then you can also look at one of the challenges that we have is how do we do the weaning. I'll talk very briefly, but I won't even really show you any slides, but we've been doing lots of work on the area of feeding forage and the fact that once you feed more milk early on in life, that we do believe that forage will play a role again in sort of the milk feeding period. That work is very early on, but we're really excited about some of the work that we've got there. And then once you do all those things, or actually only have to do the first 2 of these, feeding more milk by a nipple, and when you figure out when we show you how to wean those calves, all of that leads us to be able to open the doors to social housing. And I'm going to show you some of the work that a lot of it was led by our postdoc at the time. She's now here in the UK at Becky Meager. She was hired here, I guess, about 6 months ago in Reading. And hopefully now you guys have somebody, those of you here in Great Britain, have somebody on site that can also help navigate some of this work forward. And then lastly, some of the work that we've done with farmers on monitoring and benchmarking calf outcomes. So let's start with, how do we feed these calves? One of the things that we always do when we sort of go into an area is we look at what nature does, what happens in nature, and how do we learn from that, and how do we adapt that into sort of the intensive housing systems. And one of the things, as all of you guys know, is that a calf, when it's born, it suckles from its mom, but it's suckling from a teat. And even in North America, we had a history of, for some reason, somebody at some point in time decided that rather than suckling milk through a nipple, that we should actually spend a couple of days training calves to suck out of a bucket. And when we think about that, that's very far from what nature designed these babies to do. And so we did some work early on. My colleague Dan did this with a visiting scholar at the time. And what they actually did is they just had a stopwatch. And they gave the calves the milk in the bucket, and they actually timed how long it took those calves to drink that milk. And I'm sure you guys have all seen this, but what the calf does, it puts its head in that bucket and goes, and it drinks the entire milk in about 44 seconds. But then if you spend even just a half a second longer watching that calf drink that milk after it's drunk the milk from the bucket, what does it do? It spends, and we timed it, about 6 minutes sucking on the bucket, the chain, the whatever else it can find in its environment. It finds something to suck on. And God forbid if there's another calf in that pen, it sucks on, because it's a lot easier, or a lot, to suck on a calf's ear or its tail, or God forbid its vulva. And it just sucks and sucks, and of course that freaks us out, because now we've got an issue where there's disease transmission issues. And what was our solution to that? Is we individually housed. So when you look at a calf that sucks from a nipple, what do we see it do? Well, when it's given access to milk by a teat, it sucks, it sucks on the teat, and it does about 47 minutes worth of sucking on the teat, provided that it has enough milk. But when we give them ad libitum milk, similar, what we see is that they suck for about 47 minutes, and they spread that feeding time into about 6 to 10 milk meals. And you may not have seen this, but we've actually looked at what happens when calves suck from their mums. What do? They suck about 47 minutes a day, and they typically spread that into about 6 to 10 milk meals a day. So in the intensive environment, I can actually mimic what it does on its mother by just giving it access to a nipple bottle and lots of milk. And here we see very similar sort of this natural behaving, this sucking motivation. They're able to engage in that. And then if you do all that, what we also know is that you can virtually eliminate cross-sucking. Because why would you suck on another calf if A, you're satiated because you're not hungry anymore, and B, you've actually got a nipple or a teat that is very similar to what you would suck on in nature. And Anne-Marie de Passe and Jeff Rushin did some very interesting work where they looked at sort of the hormones that are elicited in the digestive tract of these calves, and they compared bucket-fed calves and teat-fed calves, and lo and behold, teat-fed calves, you have higher levels of insulin and cholecystokinin, which are good hormones for digestion. Significantly higher levels of these hormones in teat-fed calves than bucket-fed calves. Okay, so we've talked about teat feeding, and I've alluded a little bit to how much milk calves should have. Traditionally, in North America and in most parts of the world, the dairy industry sort of, what they ended up doing is, for some reason, they started reducing the amount of milk that calves get fed, to the point where on average calves were fed about 10% of body weight. So if you're looking at a 40-kilo Holstein calf born, that works out to about 4 liters a day. And so in this next slide, this is work done by Mohammed Khan. He had 2 treatments. So these were individually housed calves. They were teat fed, but he looked at giving calves 10%, which was the industry standard. And bear in mind, this was in 2007, where definitely in North America, there was very, very few farmers feeding more than this amount of milk. So he showed that 10% of body weight, which was the standard. He fed half of his calves that amount, and then he did something really revolutionary, which was give twice as much, which was 20% of body weight. So that worked out to about just over 8 liters a day. And then what he did is he took these calves, he fed 20% of body weight, which is the blue line, and to about 24 days of age. And I'll explain later why this 3 to 4 week period is important. And then what he did is over the course of a week, he slowly dropped them down to 10% of body weight. And then he fed them out till about day 44. And then at day 44, over the course of about 5 days, he diluted the milk. And by day 52, he had weaned these calves. Remember, from basically day 30 to day 46 or 48 here, both calves, both treatment groups were fed 10% of body weight. But because the 20% calves had already gotten so much more milk earlier on, they were heavier, and that's why you see them having more milk compared to the conventionally fed calves. So what did this look like in terms of starter intake? So one of the reasons that we've always thought of reducing the amount or feeding minimal amounts of milk is that we want to get them on starter. Because the most vulnerable time for a baby calf in terms of mortality and morbidity is during the milk feeding phase. So from a management perspective, we want to get them off milk. And we know to get them off milk, they've got to be eating other things, which in this case is starter. So the thought was, if I feed low amounts of milk, then surely they'll start eating more starter. But when you look at here now, we've got starter intake grams per day on the y-axis and calf age and days on the x-axis. Remember, those calves that are in these sort of pinky orange square dots here, they were only getting 10% of body weight. And so if the hypothesis was true that if we feed low amounts of milk, we'll get increased starter intake early on, we didn't see that. And Khan didn't see this, and there's been numerous studies done that in that first 4 weeks of life, these babies are not really able to digest starter. They want to, and they start to play with starter, but the majority of their nutrition is coming from the milk. So by feeding high volumes of milk in that first 4 weeks of life, you're giving them what they are able to digest. And so lots of milk, what does that equate to? In higher weight gains than if you feed lower volumes of milk. Remember what Khan did was at about 30 days or 4 weeks of age, he reduced the amount of milk that these higher volume fed calves were fed. And I should also say, all of the experiments that I'm showing now are all fluid milk. Because we haven't done anything in starter intake, in milk replacer. So these are calves fed milk, and so at 30 days he reduced the amount of milk down to 10%, and look what happens to starter. It starts to go up, and it actually goes up faster than those calves that are on what I could call the restricted amount. At 50 days, they were weaned, and those calves that had higher volumes of milk early on in life still have an advantage over those calves that were fed restricted amounts of milk. And he's taken this now out to 90 days. So that growth advantage is still seen at 3 months of age. There's other work done now in Israel and also there's some work coming out of Scandinavia and a series of studies now in the States where they've looked at milk production in these calves that are fed higher volumes of milk, particularly in the first 4 weeks of life, and looking at milk production. And these baby girls will thank you. They'll pay you back in increased milk production, particularly in their first lactation. And some of the studies have gone out to third lactation now, and you still see this advantage in terms of milk production. Okay, so what happened in body weight gain here, just to show that, you know, that these calves that were fed higher volumes of milk had improved weight gains right through the entire 90-day study. Okay, so now that I've shown you that feeding through a nipple is really, really important, because, and feeding higher volumes of milk, you put those two things together, and then all of a sudden group housing becomes something that could become a reality for you. And that the reason is that cross-sucking is, I mean, these calves, what they're showing us when they're cross-sucking is it's a behavior that happens when they're really, really hungry. So if you're feeding low volumes of milk, you're going to get increased cross-sucking. But you also see this behavior even if they're satiated. So let's say that you were to give them lots of milk, but you gave it through a bucket, they still have this innate desire to suck. So I guess my bottom line is you've really got to start nipple feeding, because this is what this little mammal was evolved to do. You'll see reduced cross-sucking if you teat feed and you feed them lots of milk. And then we can look at social housing. You know, this is going to become this practice of hutches and individual housing. I may be so bold to say, you know, for the public, this could be a hard sell down the road. You know, they have this vision of calves romping and playing together, and this is something that is challenging if they're just inside a hutch. So what does this mean in terms of the calf, and how do we manage this, and what are there added benefits to this sort of management style compared to individual housing? So Andrea Vieira did an experiment where she looked at individual housing compared to bear housing, and we have this picture shows you a picture of our individual housing, and what we're able to do is we're actually just able to take out the center divide of these calves. So it's exactly the same amount of space per calf. We've just taken the center divide out. There's no nipple bottle in there, but the nipple bottle would go in sort of on the right-hand side here of the picture. Oh, sorry. So you can see here's where the nipple bottle would be. Here's the starter. These calves actually had access to forage as well. There's a water bucket. And each of these calves would have the same thing. So you'd have 2 nipple bottles, 2 starter buckets, 2 forage buckets, 2 water buckets. So everything was the same as an individual calf. They just could do it together. Okay, so one of the things that Andrea did was, first of all, look at starter intake by these calves. So the individual, and she compared these pair house calves to individual calves. So this is the starter intake during the milk feeding phase, grams per day on the y-axis, and then the treatments on the x-axis. And what you can see is that although everything was the same, we did see increased intake, and this has been corrected, so this is per calf. We saw significantly more starter intake in those calves that were pair housed compared to the individual calves. And in terms of milk volume, they were all fed 8 liters a day via a nipple bottle. The milk was divided into 2 meals. They got 4 liters in the morning, and they had access to the milk for about 2 hours in the morning, and again 2 hours in the evening. They had no milk during the day. A lot of these, you know, one of the concerns that we often have is having this fresh milk during the middle of the day when it's really hot. But these calves got it sorted out very quickly. They knew that they had milk in the morning, they had milk in the evening, they sucked on those bottles, and then lo and behold, those calves that were pair housed, we had significantly more starter intake than those calves that were individually housed. What we think is going on there is what we call social facilitation. So one calf probably got up and started eating starter, and then the next, his buddy sees that he's doing that, so, oh, let me go to my own bucket. And so we think that they're just sort of motivating each other to start consuming solid feed, which resulted over the milk feeding phase an increase in starter intake. Okay, What Andrea did is starting on day 42, she started reducing the milk in both treatments. She diluted the milk out. She weaned on day 48. And then she kept the calves in these housing environments, so the pair versus the individual, for another week. And one of the things she did is she looked at the vocalizations. And I should tell you that all of these calves, these treatments, were in the same barn. We had 2 rows of individual housing where we had sort of individual pair. The individual calves could see other calves because across the way were other individual and pairs. They could hear other calves. The individual calves just couldn't touch another calf. And so what she did through the weaning phase is she looked at vocalizations. And this is the number per 2-hour period per day. And what you can see, I mean, weaning is stressful, even for the pair house calves. But if you're going to go through a stressful event, it's much better to go through with a buddy than by yourself. And so she saw nearly over twice as many vocalizations in those single house calves compared to the pair house calves. So again, here in scientific terms, what we think is happening is what we call social buffering. So, you know, this idea that if I'm going through a stressful event, to have somebody else go through, you know, for these calves to have another calf to go through with them through that stressful event seems to reduce this weaning distress. Okay, what she then did is she took an individual calf and a pair house calves, and she put them into a group house pen, which is a common practice on farms, is take them from the individual and put them into group housing. And she put them into a group house pen where she had 3 calves that were weaned that already knew how to use the automatic grain feeder. So they knew how to go into the race and access the grain. And then she measured things like latency to have their first grain meal. Remember, they were all used to grain because they'd all had access to starter during the milk feeding period. What was different now is that they were no longer getting the starter through a bucket. They were getting it through the automatic grain feeder. So this is the latency to start eating grain. So those individual calves took nearly 50 hours from the time that they were put into the group house pen until they had their first grain meal. And you compare that to the pair house calves, they had their first meal 9 hours later. A huge difference in how they coped with accessing the resource after being regrouped into this environment, this novel environment. When you look at solid feed intake, this is kilograms per day and the days after mixing or regrouping. Like I said, you know, the individually housed calves, which are the single, remember I said they took nearly 50 hours to have their first meal. So solid feed intake was 0 for 2.5 days. And then they learned how to use the grain feeder, and it increases, and we see a little bit of going up and down there compared to, and then we took this experiment out to 14 days. The take-home message here is that the intakes are much, much less variable over that 14, 15-day period in the pair house calves compared to the single house calves. Now look at weight gain. Well, if you don't eat for 50 hours, you're guaranteed your calves are going to lose weight. And so what we saw was a 2.5 kilo growth check. So that's nearly 5 pounds that they lost in 48 hours after mixing. So here's weight gain kilograms per day, and this is now going out to 14 days. And what you see is that the weight gain is very stable in those pair house calves, and it's very, very variable in the individual calves. We don't exactly know why that's happening. It could be that they are eating too much grain. Maybe this is an acidosis effect. I mean, there's lots of things that need to be found out here. We just know that the intakes are really much more variable in those single house calves than the pair house calves. Okay, one of the things that we're interested in is trying to understand that. Why do we see that variation in this latency to start eating grain after they've been mixed from an individual to and pair housing into this group? This video shows 2 calves. The white calf, the one with more white, is a calf that has been reared in its entire life as an individual. The black calf is a pair house calf, and they've never met each other. What you see is that we measured few things, but one of the things we did is we measured the latency to touch each other. The white calf took an incredibly long time to get the courage up to touch the pair-housed calf. Once it touched the calf, it didn't know how to leave it alone. It just focused exclusively on the pair-housed calf. And so I think if we could have asked that calf, you know, what does the environment look like that you just walked around in? I don't think that calf has any idea, because all it did was focus on the other calf. You take the next video, which are two pair-housed calves who have never met. And I'm going to tell you right now, this is a very, very boring video. These calves walked in, they touched each other. And then what they do, and you'll see them do this in a minute, is they start exploring their environment. And they go around, they sniff things. And I want you to think about now in terms of trying to handle. The whole effect of housing on handling has been, early life housing has been underexplored. We've got some more evidence now that these calves that are socially reared from early on in life are much calmer, much easier to handle, far less fearful than those calves that are individually housed. So one of the things that we've been interested in is this whole issue of social deprivation. We know that cattle are herd animals. They evolve to, to be reared in sort of these social groups. And so we've done actually the opposite. We've reared them in these individual housing systems, and we did it for, I think, for many good reasons at the time, is that we thought that this would improve health and reduce disease. But we know now that from social housing, the work that's been done, that in disease transmission be calves that were housed individually to those compared to those that are raised in small groups. Clearly, there's an issue if you've got a really big group. As you know, if disease gets in there, it can travel really fast between these calves. But between small groups and individual calves, there is no difference in disease transmission. But when you look at some of the very early work, and this is a picture here done by Harry Harlow in the mid-60s. He did some work on non-human primates where he took these young infant monkeys, and he reared half of them with their mother, and the other half he gave a puppet, as you can see here. And the idea was, we could give this artificial mum, and how would that impact on things like learning and the behavior of these animals. Over a series of work, he showed that these non-human primates that had been reared with these artificial mothers in social isolation had learning difficulties, abnormal social behavior, abnormal repetitive behavior. There was neurobiological changes and fear. So that brings me back to our individual calf. We had a student from France who came actually, had been doing work more on the rodent side, from the psychology side, who was totally up to speed on some of this early work done on non-human primates. And when she showed up on the farm, and we were running an experiment where we were looking at individual housing versus pair housing at that time, and she said, I'm convinced that these calves have neuro deficits, that cognitive deficits. And we're like, what are you talking about? And so we ended up setting up an experiment. And when we do a lot of these experiments, the proof of concept at first is to try to get the experimental treatments as far apart as possible. So I may shock you, some of you, for the next few slides, but what we ended up doing is we looked at comparing individually housed calves to cows that had been reared in a very complex social environment. So they actually could spend, during the day they were separated from their mum, but they could nose touch with their mom, and during the night, hold your breath, we put a bra on the cow. So the calf could spend time with its mother, but not suckle. I mean, and this is part of another series of questions that we had regarding, is suckling part of the bonding process or not? To answer that question, no, suckling has little to do with the bond, but that's a story for another day. But what we were really interested in this specific question was raising these calves in these complex environments where they were with their mother. How did that impact some of these behavioral changes that Harry Harlow had shown in non-human primates and others had shown in the rodent literature, both particularly in mice. So we were looking at the effects of social rearing on basically learning and cognition. So Becky and Rouen and a bunch of students spent an incredibly devoted a lot of time to training calves. And many of you think, can we actually train calves? Well, I'll show you a video in a second. We can definitely train calves, and they love to learn. So half of these calves were taught, and I'll show you a video in a second that will put all this into context, that they were brought into an arena. There was a computer screen at the end of the arena, and the calves were taught they had to tell us that they were willing to start playing the game. They had to touch a start box, and then they had to look at the computer screen at the back of the arena. And if the computer screen turned white, they had to rush over, touch the computer screen, and then they got a milk reward. For those calves, if the computer screen turned red, they weren't supposed to go. And if they went, they got a timeout. And then they had to wait in order to start the game again. And I can tell you that calves hated this. And so they didn't like the timeouts. And so this is what we call the discrimination learning curve. So here on the bottom, the x-axis is the number of sessions in the training phase. 1 and 2, so we did morning and afternoon training sessions. And so number 1 would have been in the morning of the first day. Number 2 session was the afternoon of the first day. 3 and 4 were day 2. 5 and 6 were day 3. 7, 8, day 4. And so basically this is 7 days of data. And so what you can see is this is basically the success in the learning phase. And what you can see, those calves that have been housed with their mother in this complex environment, by about day 4, they got it. They knew exactly what they were doing. And they got 100% of the time they were correct. What happened to the individual housed calves? They were pretty smart. They learned how to do this. They had a little bit of bump on day 3, but by and large, they were able to learn this game really, really well, and just as well as those calves that had been reared socially. So here's a video. Here the calf, this is a calf where red was positive. You would have noticed he touched the start box, or she touched the start box. She looked at the screen, it was red, she went. This calf, white, there she's not allowed to go. She gets it, she knows exactly what she's doing. And again, she touches it, sees that it's red, and she gets her milk reward. So like I said, it didn't matter how these calves grew up, whether or not they were socially housed, or whether or not with their mothers, or whether or not they individually housed, they could learn the game. Then we changed the rules. If white had been positive, now red is positive before. So they had to do the opposite of what they were learning before. What happened? So these are the socially housed calves. And you can see when we go into this that at first, the first day, they got 100% wrong. And they kept, what do you want from me? And then all of a sudden, in the morning on day 3, they got the wrong. But by the afternoon, day 2, in the morning, they were still getting things wrong. By the afternoon of the second day, it was like a light bulb went off, and they went, oh, you want me to do the opposite? Okay, no problem. It took them a few times, so but by day 4 or 5, they were sort of getting there, and by 7 days into this, they were 100% correct. Now, what happened to the individually housed calves? They didn't get it. Becky, so some did, but Becky and the other students, the experiment finished after 7 days, and they felt really sorry for these individually housed calves. They actually took them out for another 7 days, and they were not able to increase the performance of these calves. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing this, they were very anxious, but they kept returning to what they had learned before, which was basically they weren't flexible. And this was exactly the same thing that Harry Harlow had seen with non-human primates and others had seen with rodents. So what we also showed was calves that, Harry Harlow had shown that these animals were fearful of new things and new foods in particular. So João Costa, as part of his PhD, took these calves that were individually housed and socially housed, and he looked at how much food would they eat a food that they'd never seen before. And he did two things. He looked at hay, and then he looked at something really radical like carrots that he knew for sure they had never seen before. And this is the intake in grams per test. So he did 15-minute tests at how much food would they eat of this novel food. This is individual and this is social. And when we look at why is it that the socially housed calves could eat more, it's nearly all explained about how long it took for the calves to have courage to go look inside the bucket. The individual calves took forever to get the courage up to go to the back of the pen and look inside the bucket. They were so scared compared to the socially housed calves. So just to wrap up now is, practically speaking, of course, we are not in a position at this point to keep, cows and calves together, and God forbid we have to put bras on cows. How can we look at this from a practical perspective? Well, I'm going to come back to pair housing. Asking the question, what type of contact is needed? So Becky Meager led this experiment. She looked at 4 treatments. She looked at calves that were individually housed, calves that were individually housed for 6 weeks, and then pair housed from early on, from basically the first week of life. And then we also included this complex environment where they had access to their mom as another treatment. Here I'm showing you the percentage of calves that were successful in the reversal. So all calves could learn how to play that game, that video I showed you, but then what happens when we change the rules on them? And what you can see is that early paired calves did just as well as those calves that had been reared with their mom. Individual, again, and this is a completely different set of calves, struggled again. But those calves that had been weaned, that had been paired at 6 weeks, did better than the individual, but not as well as the early pair. And this comes back to, I think, what we're trying to do is provide options for farms. Your farms are different in 1,000 ways, and different management schemes. So maybe pairing from the first week of life is not something that works for you now, but even just pairing for the last 2 weeks of the milk feeding period does add some benefit. It's not as good as pairing early on, but you can see that we can reduce some of these negative cognitive deficits that we see in the early in the individual pair housed calves. Again, what we also saw is here now. This is just looking at Oops, I've taken out the complex environment and looking at intake in terms of grams of dry matter. And this is calves that were late paired versus early paired. We see the social facilitation helping in terms of solid food intake, but even in the last 2 weeks of the milk feeding period, we're seeing an increase in solid feed intake compared to those individual housed calves. So just lastly, just a couple things about benchmarking calf performance on, this is British Columbia dairy farms. We've been interested in trying to motivate farmers to actually learn from each other. And this is an experiment where we did biological data for measuring calf outcomes. We did a lot of interview-based data, and we benchmarked. We worked with veterinarians together. Each farms we had, here I've shown what we did is we had a master's student and a PhD student, and they worked with the veterinarian, and they went on farms and they measured 2 things. They measured every week for 6 weeks. We looked at the passive transfer, so we took serum proteins of those calves to get an idea of how well the colostrum feeding management practices were, and we also taped the calves to look at how the weight gains were. And then we got a lot of management data from those farms, and then farms got a report back. The report from our perspective was confidential in that the farmer, we never told any other farmer, who else was in a study. In this particular farm, he was told that this was his farm, but he has no idea who the other farmers are. That's for the farmers to tell the story about whether or not they're in an experiment or not. But what you can see is that there's tremendous variation. Whoa, sorry, there was just a ding in my ear. Oh. There's tremendous variation across farms. The idea here is to try to give farmers data from their farms and also to give them context. I mean, for years we've been telling, calves should be able to gain close to 1 kilo a day, and I can stand up here like a talking head and tell you that that's a good thing. But unless you know what your calves are gaining on your farm, that it's difficult for you to do anything with that data. So we had these farms in this experiment. They got their benchmarking report, and then they were given the option of whether or not they wanted to leave the experiment or stay in and work with their veterinarian and change something. And then we would come back for another 6 weeks. DAX came back and measured things for another 6 weeks, and then they got a second report. We did 10 farms in the first cohort, 8 farms in the second cohort, and I can tell you that all 18 farms decided to stay for the second round of the study because they actually found it really exciting. This is just some of and what we were able to do with the 2 reports is to look to see whether or not they actually changed practice. So I'm just going to focus now on the average daily gains, kilograms per day. These are the 18 farms, the measures of their first report. Farms had a choice. They could do nothing. They could focus on colostrum, or they could focus on average daily gain, whatever. It was up to them to decide what they wanted to do. So these are the farms in the second round that elected to do a change. And what you can see here is that some changed some things, didn't move, but we see a number of farms that when they worked with their vet, they changed something and they were actually able to improve their average daily gains. There were some farms that elected to do no change with regards to their milk feeding practices. The higher ones didn't change much. What's interesting down here is that some farms got worse, but remember, they also had the option of changing colostrum feeding practices. And so, some farms may have decided to elect to change colostrum feeding and not focus on average daily gain. And when we talked to some of these farmers, the feedback was that, as I focused on something, I actually sort of loosened my eye on what was happening in terms of my milk feeding practices. So just a final end to change here is, or to sum up, is definitely feed more milk via nipple, feed more milk using step down weaning. I think there's some, I just showed you some of the data that when we, or some the pictures with the calves that were pair housing that we were actually feeding forage, we've seen no detrimental effects of feeding forage. And actually, in fact, we've seen some work, we've done some work now, we've actually shown that we can ease transition by actually introducing forage earlier on, because then they know what this forage is actually about, because after weaning this becomes a part of their daily diet. I think I've hopefully shown you some ways to provide social housing for calves, and that there's tremendous benefits, for you as farmers to have data on your own farms, but also to monitor and then looking at benchmarking calf outcomes. Lastly, I've been talking with Jenny a lot about their program Calf to Calving, and they've got 12 host farms. There's meetings every 3 months, and it sounds like to me this is a really super initiative that that you're also looking at some of these things. But on that note, thank you very much, and I'm going to hand it back to Jenny.